There's a couple of good reasons for adding glue in addition to our nails. One is it adds a lot of strength to the structure. It helps attach the top plate into the studs and down to the bottom plate. And in our case, we have this large eave on the high side of our structure. It'll help ensure that our roof stays on in heavy winds.
You come and go like a monsoon rain. You hide and show like a lightning bolt. You have it all.
In this video series, I take you through the process of how we created this backyard art studio. It features 3 large windows and glass doors to allow natural light to fill the interior. It also includes an outdoor covered awning space with a hardwood batten privacy screen. We chose to use passive house design systems in the construction to make the most of the year-round weather conditions. In the previous episode, we were able to remove the scaffolding for the beam and posts we'd set in concrete for the outside awning area. I added additional bracketing to support the beams into the walls, then moved on to completing all the blocking that'll be necessary for securing the marine ply panels we'll be adding later. I got some assistance from my client's partner to install the last of our pre-painted roof rafters. I then secured the transition between the inside and the outside of our studio with a different design in the block layout. This was to add extra strength to the open roof, as it'll be exposed to strong winds that'll create uplift in the framing of our structure. With the roof frame mostly complete in the covered side of our studio, I started installing some of the pre-painted marine ply roof sheeting, then installed the last of the blocks necessary for the roof frame, pre-painted in black, as this will be the colour of the outside of the studio. In this episode, we'll be adding the OSB wall sheeting and membrane, but first we have to add the rough openings for the doors and windows. To save money on our build, my client chose to purchase factory second doors and windows instead of new ones. They arrived on our job site a couple of weeks ago, so now I can accurately build the rough openings for them. To help accurately position the door and window on this wall of the studio, I've created timber templates out of framing material. This way I can adjust the position back and forth until the client's satisfied where she wants her door and window. By establishing a center point for the opening, I can accurately build the rough framing that'll fit the windows we have on site. I always work with wood templates for the width of the window, as it avoids mistakes that can be made with your tape measure. With the window and door clearly marked out on the top and bottom plates of the wall, I can start removing the temporary studs. Because I had a general idea of where the door and window was going to go when I framed this wall, I was careful to make sure the studs were going to be easily removable for this part of the process. Once the king studs are set in the correct position, I add the cripple studs that'll be holding the lintel or the header in place. The king stud on the right hand side of this door happens to align directly next to one of the standard studs, so I'm using liquid nails with screws to attach the king stud to the standard stud for a solid door frame. With the king stud secured, I add the lintel to the top of the opening. In this case, I'm using a piece of 190 by 45 for the lintel material. I use one of my clamps to help hold it in place whilst I set it in the right position with my rubber hammer. I then secure it in place with the same 14 gauge timber screws we've been using throughout our framing. I then add a second piece of 190 by 45 to the inside of the doorway. Besides adding a lot of strength to the lintel, it'll also create the framing plane for the inside sheeting that'll come later.
As a young girl, it feels we're mine. We played hide and seek for hours, raised our shadows among the pines. So offshore, playful and free, without a care in the world. I was one rich little girl, daydreamer, kidnap me. Take me back, all the way back to them days, running around in a gown and a crown, barefoot
the first door frame complete, I used my reciprocating saw to cut the bottom plate out. This will make it a lot easier to sweep the water out that's been building up on the slab due to all the rain.
We spent summers catching fireflies and winters on our skates. One big smile across my face. We used to dance our way to church on Sundays. Mama set the pace.
The rough frame for the window opening in this wall is going to require a different approach due to the 3-metre width of the window. I need to set a temporary beam that's wider than our window opening to help hold the roof up whilst we remove the unneeded studs. I clamp the beam tight up against the roof rafters until I fix temporary screws to hold it in place. I add half a dozen 14-gauge timber screws through the beam into the top plate and then add a temporary stud in the centre of it. It's now safe for me to remove the temporary studs from the wall and add the king studs that'll define the edge of the window. The wall studs come out easily because I fixed them in place with a screw on a 45-degree angle so they could be easily removed at this stage of the process. I do one last double check with my tape measure before I cut the lintel to size. I ordered a custom-made laminated beam for this opening due to its extreme width. I don't have any spare material for this beam, so it's always worth double measuring and even triple measuring for cutting a unique piece of material like this. I set this window lintel the same way we did the door lintel earlier, taking extra care to make sure it sits flat on the plane of the outside of our wall.
Daydreaming is my new middle name. This is not a game for me. Imagine it is my new best friend. And raise all I see. I got a PhD in love. My heart covers every degree. There's no guarantee in love. No, we just have to wait and see.
After installing the studs that sit underneath the lintel, we can remove the temporary beam we set up earlier. For a window this size, we double up the cripple studs that sit under the lintel for extra strength over the width. I removed the screws we used in the temporary beam and put it aside for later. I'll be using some of this material for lintels in the other windows. To complete the window frame, we need to build a short wall that'll be sitting under the window and supporting its weight. The framing pattern is the same as the rest of our walls, which is 600 on centre, so I've cut 6 identical studs at 900mm and start installing them on both sides of the window. I measure and cut the sill and then install the other 4 studs on the 600mm layout, matching the rest of our wall. All the door and window rough openings we're building are built 20mm wider and 20mm higher than the actual window. This way when we install the window, we'll have a 10mm gap on all 4 edges of the window or the door. I then add some 45mm framing material to thicken out the lintel to match our 90mm wall. This will give me somewhere to attach the inside sheeting. The other 2 windows we'll be installing in the studio are identical to each other. They're 2.1 metres high and 1200 wide. I've added a temporary beam to support the roof whilst we remove the temporary studs like we did on the previous window. Here I'm using one of the studs that has to be removed and placing it in the centre of our temporary beam for extra support. I can now safely remove the final stud for our opening and install the king studs for the window. I need a tight fit for the king studs that connect from the bottom plate to the top plate, but not so tight that they push the top plate out of plumb. I use my rubber hammer to gently tap them into the correct position and then double check with my set square that they're sitting 90 degrees on the bottom and top plate. I'm using treated timber framing for the king studs and cripples of all the doors and windows. as doors and windows are never perfect and can sometimes leak, and this is often where rot can get started and then move throughout the framing of the wall. After installing the cripples and lintel, I can remove the temporary beam and reuse it on the next opening.
Yesterday, there was sun and there was rain, beauty in the mundane. And as the light startled our eyes, we let go of despair. And now there's something in the air and a sparkly shimmer on our skin, restoring everything within.
Here I'm taking my time to trim down the king stud so it fits snugly but not too tight. It's important that we don't push the wall out of square when we're adding the new studs. Once the king studs are secured in place, I add the cripples that'll support the lintel over the opening. I use liquid nails as well as our 14 gauge timber screws to attach the cripples to the king studs, as this is what the window will be attached to. So I want an extra strong connection into the framing. Here I'm installing screws at a 45-degree angle through the cripple into the bottom plate as all the weight from the roof gets transferred to the lintel, then down to the cripples and into this bottom plate. With this window rough opening complete, I can remove the temporary beam.
Dreamy, breezy, we go. Easy, easy on our tiptoes. Undercover agents of the other. Beyond gravel, beyond all.
The final opening we're preparing is for a doorway under the open awning area. I've set up some scrap timbers to create a ledge so I can place the lintel in the correct position easily and fix it in with our heavy 14 gauge timber screws. I then glue and screw the cripples under the lintel into the floor plate, using my clamp to help keep it in line with the exterior plane of the wall. To complete this doorway opening, I cut the bottom plate out with my reciprocating saw flush to the cripples. This completes the rough openings for all our doors and windows. One of the last things I need to do in preparation for sheeting the walls is add horizontal blocking at 1200 and 2400 heights. This is an essential part of the strength of the framing and also creates an overlap point for sheeting material on the outside and inside of our walls.
Lift up your head and lead. Count the stars up before you leave. Save a kiss, pretty please. Try to reminisce over me. Know that I will cherish your memories.
Last week we completed all the framing for the doors and windows so we can move on to sheeting our walls. Unfortunately, we discovered we had a problem with our plywood ceiling panels. The bottom of them is covered with polyurethane so they look like natural timber, and the top is painted in black because we had plenty of black paint. Unfortunately, it's leached through the plywood, so it's ruined the finish from underneath. So we're going to have a completely different approach of how we deal with these ceiling panels. I left this panel in place because we're still going to put the fascia on the front of this roof, so it might be handy for standing on. My goal this week is to have all these walls sheeted with our bracing ply. Because of all the pre-painted elements we're using in the roof frame, this is often what determines when it's time to install something. With that in mind, the last final element of the roof, which is the fascia that runs the entire length of the building, is painted and ready for installation. Our roof is 8.5 meters long, and the 190 by 45 material we're using only comes in 6 meter lengths. so I'll be using 2 pieces to cover the span. With a combination of some temporary timber bracing and my clamps, I manoeuvre this first larger piece into position. When the fascia is aligned with this first rafter, I start adding our 14 gauge timber screws. I'm using 2 different length screws for this installation. I'm using 100mm screws that go into the blocking we added earlier, and I'm using 150mm screws to go into the rafters. I use my clamp to hold the fascia flat to the roof frame whilst I secure it with our 14 gauge timber screws. Moving from one rafter to the next. As each section of the fascia becomes secured, remove the temporary timber braces that were holding it in place. The 2 pieces that make up the fascia are joined with a 30-degree cut, which will help stop a gap developing over time. Once I've secured the end of this first larger piece of fascia, I install the shorter piece on the far end of the roof.
Tonight we'll turn minutes into days, and nothing's gonna make me look away. Peel off a layer and breathe. Lift up your head and lead. Count the stars before you leave. Save a kiss, pretty please. Try to learn the miss over me. Know that I will cherish your memory.
The installation of this fascia concludes the roof frame. Later I'll be filling these screw holes and touching them up with black paint for a better finish. One of the passive house design elements we're adding to our art studio is creating an air cavity between the wall insulation and the outside cement sheeting that clads our building. The air gap between the insulation and the cement sheet is created by battens that have a vent at the bottom of the wall. So one of the important steps is to install a bug screen at the bottom of the wall so no insects and termites can enter the void. I'm attaching strips of fly mesh with my staple gun that'll wrap over the bottom of the battens later. I wanted to have this in place before we started putting our OSB sheeting on the walls. To ensure the OSB sheeting isn't damaged by moisture by the air vent that we'll be installing in the bottom of the wall, I'm using packers to create a 5mm gap that I'll be injecting Sikaflex into to create a waterproof connection point between the OSB and the slab. The OSB bracing sheets I'm using are 6mm thick, 1200mm wide by 2700 high. Here I'm using clamps to hold the first sheet in place while I scribe pencil marks for the cuts. I often find it easier to scribe the material in place and then be able to make an accurate cut. After checking this first sheet for fit, I apply a bead of liquid nails around the entire perimeter of the sheet where it's going to join the framing, and then secure it with my nail gun. An easy way to calculate the cut for the second sheet is to use the offcut from the first sheet, as it serves as a template for the 5-degree roof angle we need to cut on the top of the sheet. One of the reasons we framed the walls with our studs at a 600mm centre layout is so standard sheeting material like this OSB will lay across 3 studs without any adjustment necessary. My nail pattern is about 150mm between nails. Because of the extra layers of material we'll be adding to the wall for our passive house design systems, I need to leave room for other fixings that'll be coming later with the battens and the final sheeting. Gluing the OSB onto the frame with liquid nails can get messy if you're not careful. So I'm using a system where I lightly tack the side of the sheet in the correct position on the framing. This enables me to open a gap in the panel and add the glue down to the other side. Once I've completed the glue bead, I lightly tack this side to the frame, open up the other side and repeat the process. Once I've finished applying all the liquid nails to the frame, I hand nail the panel back onto the frame and then finish it off with my nail gun. To ensure all the nail heads are flush with the OSB, I go over our finished wall with my hammer to tap any nail heads flush with the sheeting. This completes the first wall. Tomorrow I'll start on the wall next to it that has the doorway and the large window.
Turn around and show your face and you'll see parts of you. Oh my, our bodies interlace, slow and easy. And I can reach you from a distance. I can, so beautiful. I can hear you within the silence. Ooh, we will dance away the gloomy days right here. We are silver line, one of a kind, you and me.
I chose to use orientated strand board as our bracing paneling because it's half the price of plywood. One of its disadvantages is it can absorb a lot of moisture, so when our panels were delivered, we sprayed them with a wood sealant. This ensures our OSB won't absorb any water whilst it's exposed to the weather before we get the roof on. There's a couple of good reasons for adding glue in addition to our nails for the panels. One is it adds a lot of strength to the structure. It helps attach the top plate into the studs and down to the bottom plate. This will help stop uplift in the building from strong winds. And in our case, we have this large eave on the high side of our structure. So by gluing the OSB to the frame, it'll help ensure that our roof stays on in heavy winds. Other good reasons for gluing the panels is it stops insects and micro drafts being able to penetrate the walls.
Give me tears so I can cry. And give me heart so I don't die. Give me tears so I can cry. And give me heart so I don't die.
Every wall in our studio has a slightly different challenge on how we go about sheeting it. This last wall has a different framing configuration from the rest of the walls, as I needed to create supports for the bridging blocks in the roof we did earlier. Because this wall has a 5-degree rake in the roof, just like the first wall we sheeted, I'm able to use one of the offcuts from the first wall as a template. By aligning the offcut to the height of the wall, then double checking with my set square that it's completely parallel to the factory edge of the sheet, I can easily scribe the 5-degree angled pencil mark I'll need to cut this piece to fit the new wall. After cutting this sheet so it fits the framing configuration of the wall, I clamp it in its final position so I can scribe the cutout necessary for the doorway. Another way of achieving the door and window cutouts on the panels is to fix the sheet in place and then make this cut with a reciprocating saw. I prefer to scribe the cutout with a pencil and then cut it with my circular saw, as I achieve a smoother cut for the rough opening. This can make it easier for installing the waterproof flashing elements that we'll be doing later.
Love heart is not in vain. Scarred by the good fight. Weathered skin from the sun. We're proud you have lived well.
last step in completing the installation of our bracing panels is to add the Sikaflex sealant to the bottom edge of all our panels. When we attached the panels to the walls, I used 5mm packets at the bottom of the panels to create a gap we could inject the sealant into. This is to protect the bottom edge of the OSB from getting any moisture into it, as the edges of OSB can be vulnerable to moisture penetration. I smooth out the Sikaflex bead with a packer to ensure I'm not leaving a bump in the wall plane for the elements that will be added later. One last element I need to complete on the roof fascia we installed earlier is to trim the end of it off flush to the eaveless side of our building. Often with a long, difficult piece of material to install like this fascia, it's more practical to leave it a little long and then trim it off exactly where you need later. I then finish off the cut with my orbitable sander so I can round over the edges to match the rest of the framing material. The last thing I need to prepare before adding our membrane is to cut a rough opening for a pet door we'll be installing on the side of our studio. I aligned my drill from the inside of the wall to create holes in the four corners so my jigsaw could complete the cutout. Once the cut is complete, I smooth off the edges with my sander and then coat the exposed edge of the OSB with liquid nails to help protect it from moisture. The wall skin of our studio is made up of 4 elements: 6mm orientated strand board for strength, breathable membrane for waterproofing, foil board for insulation, and painted cement sheet to keep the elements out. And today we'll be installing the breathable membrane. I'm using a purpose-made house wrap that comes in a 2.7 metre wide roll. The floor of our studio will be a good place to cut and measure the pieces we need whilst keeping it relatively clean. I use the side of the roll as a straight edge to make 90-degree cuts in the membrane. I'm cutting my pieces slightly oversized so we can trim off the excess once they're stapled in place. I add a few staples to the top of the piece to hold it in place, whilst I add more staples to the bottom edge to secure it more accurately. I then continue to add more staples on the top and bottom to tighten up the membrane onto the wall. When the membrane is sitting flat on the wall, I start adding staples to the perimeter. I then trim off the excess with my Stanley knife and start applying the silver adhesive tape along the corner's edge. Managing the silver tape can be tricky as it's extremely sticky and will stick to itself quite easily. With the left-hand edge secure to the corner, I can stretch out the right-hand edge and staple it flat to the wall. I use my straight edge and Stanley knife to trim off the excess and then add more silver tape to seal it in place.
Spending a Sunday at the gym, trying to fit in. Counting the days until I meet my future husband. I try to be kind to myself. I said, girl, you got this. A whole lot of ticking, not enough time, not enough time.
I continue to use the same process of slightly overcutting the size of the pieces I'm using so I can trim them down after I've got them tight to the wall with my staple gun. When the membrane's flat to the wall, I trim off the excess with my straight edge. I'm leaving a 50mm gap on the edge of all the windows and doors as part of the flashing process that'll be coming later. The manufacturer of this membrane product recommends there's 150mm overlap whenever you're joining 2 sheets. I'm not adding any membrane material now to the areas above the doors and windows, as I'll be adding that later as part of the flashing process to keep the windows waterproof.
9 to 5 was my dad's advice. Don't think twice, I want the luxury life. My beauty can lose it, I'll use it. I'll take what I want. Oh yeah. A whole lot of ticking, but not enough time. A whole lot of work for a trophy wife like me. Oh.
With half our walls covered with the membrane, I continue the process on the other 2 walls, making sure to tape all the edges where the staple holes are. I don't want any staple holes in the middle field of the membrane to create leak points for moisture.
Slow traffic caused me a stress. Show no panic, I'm just born in a dress. And I know that I'm older, I'm done. I'll do what I want. I'll do what I want. Spending a Sunday at the gym, trying to fit in. Counting the days until I meet my future husband. I try to be kind to myself. I said, girl, you got this. A whole lot of ticking, not enough time, not enough time. A whole lot of sweat for a trophy ride, for this trophy ride. The clock keeps ticking, still running out of time.
Join me in the next episode as we finish off flashing elements for the doors and windows and install the exterior insulation over our membrane.
Could you hike back to it, fight with it, sit with it?